Ever since Donald Trump won the 2024 election, I have seen videos like this all over social media.
Is it just me, or is there a similarity here between Ivanka's dress and Serena's? Like, was it inspired by, or we actually are just about to watch the real-life Handmaid's Tale unfold in America?
On top of videos like this, we get headlines like this, or like this, or like this. In fact, in November 2024, immediately following the presidential election, The Handmaid's Tale experienced a surge in popularity. Sales increased over 7,000%. Seems like these trends are indicative of growing public concern surrounding the Christian right and the apparent threat that it poses to women's rights and freedoms. As a Christian woman on the right myself, I found these comparisons to be intriguing. So I actually took it upon myself to actually watch The Handmaid's Tale for the first time in my life, and suffice it to say, it left me shocked. In today's video, we're going to do a deep dive into the world of the Christian right, feminist hysteria, and The Handmaid's Tale. We're going to talk about what the book is about, what it's not about, and whether we are living in the early days of Gilead. Spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that we are not. Let's just get straight into it. As a very basic overview, The Handmaid's Tale is a book written by Canadian author Margaret Atwood that talks about this dystopian society in which this theocratic Christian regime comes to power in the United States called Gilead. Prior to this violent revolution, readers are told that there is a crazy fertility crisis that is affecting the entire world. Once this Christian group comes to power, they essentially enforce extremely strict gender roles and enslave the remaining fertile women in order to force them to reproduce with elite men. The important things to note about this narrative is that the women are treated essentially as slaves, as human cattle, and that this government comes to power through a very violent coup d'etat, essentially through massacring every member of Congress, and this government also executes anybody who disagrees with them. Obviously, all of this sounds horrible, totalitarian, evil. All these adjectives are accurate representations of the kind of society that is depicted in The Handmaid's Tale. But the main question that I'm interested in is whether or not we are living in the early days of Gilead. In the book and in the movie, you see the foreshadowing of this horrible regime and the rhetoric of the Christians who are becoming politically active. And because there is a sort of slow descent into tyranny in The Handmaid's Tale, as is characteristic of many totalitarian societies of history, people have criticized the current Christian right, especially the Trump administration, as bearing very creepy similarities to the Republic of Gilead in its very early days. While it seems on the face of it that there are some sort of similarities, the more you probe into these alleged points of contact, the more you find that these political ideologies are as different as they could possibly be. So let's talk about it. J.D. Vance recently spoke at the March for Life in 2025 and garnered a lot of criticism for making the following statement.
Let me say very simply, I want more babies in the United States of America.
Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from Him.
I saw some TikTok videos comparing J.D. Vance to one of the characters in The Handmaid's Tale because obviously the people in The Handmaid's Tale are also very pro people having more babies, and also he has a beard too, so I guess somehow they look alike and they sound sort of alike. But what J.D. Vance said is not unusual for the Christian right. Lots of people in the Christian right believe in this sentiment called pronatalism. And as the name implies, pronatalism is simply the view that it is good for more people to have babies. It is for natalism, birth. Essentially, it is a very simple view that government should be interested in encouraging people to have more kids by creating favorable conditions in which families can flourish. While it is true that the Republic of Gilead is also pronatalist, it doesn't follow from that fact that the Christian right is just like Gilead. And this is why. Pronatalism is not a bad goal to have. The people in The Handmaid's Tale are not immoral for positing pronatalism as a societal goal. Where they go wrong is in pursuing immoral means to actualize this goal. The goal of wanting more people in society to have children is not inherently bad. I think if you just sit and think about it for some time, you find that that's the case. In fact, it makes a lot of sense. It isn't just people on the right who talk about the implications for a falling fertility rate. People across the political aisle recognize that when birth rates are low and below replacement level, this can have severe implications for society, especially economic ones. So obviously it is within the interest of the government to create favorable conditions for people to have families. This could include tax cuts for married couples, maternal leave programs, or even just good economic policies to tackle the cost of living crisis that is making it so hard for so many people to have children. In short, government can encourage people to have more kids by addressing the underlying reasons why people are opting out of parenthood and creating, again, the favorable economic and societal conditions within which families can flourish. All of that sounds extremely common sense to me. The difference between the Christian right today and this fictional regime is that this fictional regime utilizes extraordinarily immoral means to achieve a good end. And this is something that flies in the face of basic Christian theological ethics. And by the way, if you take any introduction to ethics class, you're going to learn that there are several different categories within the world of ethics, philosophically speaking. One of these schools of thought is called consequentialism. And very simply put, consequentialism maintains that a course of action is moral if it produces good outcomes. And whether or not Christians are deontologists or virtue ethicists, they have historically been opposed to consequentialism. Christians have historically been opposed to the idea that it is consequences that make something good or bad. Christians say, yeah, but there are just some things that are intrinsically evil. The ends don't justify the means. This is standard Christian theology. This is literally Christian ethics 101. And if you take any time to read the Bible, you'll find that this is the case. And so this is obviously a totally outlandish and unrealistic straw man of the Christian goal of being pro-family and pro-natalist, which is why, again, this book belongs in the fiction section of your local bookstore. The second point of comparison that most people draw is on the issue of quote-unquote reproductive rights. Now, obviously, that term is extremely politically charged, but the point still stands that most pro-choice activists who criticize anti-abortion legislation usually utilize costumes from The Handmaid's Tale as a sign of protest. Now, to remind you of the plot of The Handmaid's Tale, the remaining fertile women are forced to reproduce, and this forced reproduction constitutes a violation of their bodily rights, their dignity, their autonomy, and essentially their personhood. But anti-abortion legislation doesn't force anybody to become a mother. Anti-abortion legislation tells women who are already mothers that they cannot choose to not be a mother by killing their child. Every single woman who acquires an abortion is pregnant and is thus, in a broad sense of the word, a mother. What people who make this comparison don't seem to understand is that the main point of debate between pro-lifers and pro-choicers on the abortion issue has to do with who the unborn is. It has to do with the moral status of the unborn baby in the woman's womb. When people argue in support of abortion using this sort of phraseology of my body and my choice, or we have to be able to choose when to become mothers, it disingenuously frames anti-abortion legislation as forceful insemination and forced reproduction programs. And that is simply not the case. There is no disagreement between pro-lifers and pro-choicers about the fact that women have to have rights to their own body. What they disagree on is whether or not the body that is inside the woman's body has bodily rights of its own. But my main point here isn't to convince you of this. It's simply to point out the fact that this kind of rhetoric begs the question for the pro-abortion position and flagrantly misses the main point of debate between pro-lifers and pro-choicers, and is therefore extraordinarily unrealistic. It is not the case that there is an analogy between anti-abortion legislation and this sort of horrible forced surrogacy regime in The Handmaid's Tale, simply because the baby already exists. And while I'm on this point, I think it's also interesting to note that the societal practice that is actually more analogous to the horror of The Handmaid's Tale is surrogacy. Surrogacy, as it is practiced around the world today, treats women's bodies as vessels to carry the children of other people. The only difference between surrogacy commonly practiced today and in The Handmaid's Tale is that the women today seemingly consent. But even this is sort of questionable given that there have been documented cases of abuse in the surrogacy industry, and the lines of consent are sort of blurred when compensation is involved. So all of that to say, on the point of reproductive rights, there is no analogy there because the baby already exists. Nobody is forcing women to become mothers. They're telling women who are already mothers that they do not have a right to dismember the baby that is inside of their womb. The last point that people often make is the fact that the Christian right is religious, and apparently the people in The Handmaid's Tale are religious too. People on the Christian right are religious, and perhaps the people in The Handmaid's Tale are religious too, but the Christian right is Christian, and the people in The Handmaid's Tale in this fictional theocratic society are just that, fiction. There are no Christians that I'm aware of who would ever say that, as I said earlier, it's okay to pursue and end like more children through such an immoral means, such as forced slavery. Yes, it is the case that there are societies in the past and professing Christians who have partaken in horrible things like slavery, but it is also the Christian religion that inspired revolutions against that, revolutions that ended up in the progression of human societies and in the establishment of universal human rights. And that's the last point I want to make in this video, and it is a point of irony, essentially kind of like an internal critique, which is this. While The Handmaid's Tale depicts this sort of theocratic Christian society, which is obviously implicitly supposed to criticize Christian fundamentalism, it relies on intuitions given to the West by Christianity. In other words, the reason why we judge the society in The Handmaid's Tale as so evil is actually because of standards that we have inherited from Christianity. Let that sink in for a second. Usually people point to The Handmaid's Tale as a case in point, a perfect example of the danger of Christian fundamentalism. But it is precisely Christian doctrine and its inextricable connection to our Western framework, our Western way of viewing the world, that allows us to look at The Handmaid's Tale and judge it as immoral. If you were going to show this TV show to somebody else at another point in history, in another area, it could likely be the case that they would look at you in stupor. And they might say something along the lines of, "What's wrong with that? Aren't women just naturally inferior? Aren't there some people who are naturally born slaves?" In fact, this was the consensus of the ancient world. Plato and Aristotle are famously considered to be defenders of slavery, when in reality, they weren't technically defenders of slavery because there was nobody saying it was wrong. They weren't defending an institution because there was no opposition to it. They considered it as natural and normal and unquestionable. When you look at nature, all you see is variance and degrees of difference. On what basis can you ground human equality? The very reason why we do not like the society in The Handmaid's Tale is precisely because we value autonomy. It's precisely because we value equality and we value human beings as inherently worthy. Not worthy because they can help us, not worthy because they can contribute to some societal end. They're not worthy because they can birth more humans. No, they're worthy just simply in virtue of the fact that they are human, and that is enough. But the second I start listing all these things, it starts to sound very Christian. And that is because this language is soaked in the doctrines of Christianity. Even atheist historian Tom Holland has recognized this in his book Dominion. He essentially argues that these values that we take so for granted in the Western world, again, values of progress, autonomy, consent, human rights, equality, dignity, all of these are owed to the Christian Revolution. Maybe you are an atheist and a progressive who thinks it's possible to ground these things outside of God. And I'm not arguing with you about that. Even though I disagree, that's not my point. You can ground them somewhere else, but you cannot deny that historically speaking, the reason why these values have become so popularized in the West is because of Christianity. And to argue otherwise is to miss the point and to honestly be so intellectually dishonest. So, I know I'm getting very passionate about this, but I genuinely and wholeheartedly believe that Christianity started a revolution in the world, one that uplifted people, one that uplifted minorities, especially women. In fact, one of the main reasons why Christianity grew as a religion in the 2nd century is because so many women were flocking to Christianity because they saw how much value they were given according to Christianity. Or take, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus essentially levels the playing field and corrects the double standard that existed in antiquity towards women. Women were expected to be pure virgins on their wedding night, while men were allowed to exploit their sexual advantage. Jesus says no. He says, if you so much as look at a woman with lust in your heart, you have committed adultery in your heart. That is true Christianity. True Christianity acknowledges the dignity of human persons. True Christianity does not say the ends justify the means. True Christianity acknowledges that women are made in the image of God just as men are, and actually posits an adequate ground for human equality that I would go so far as to argue that you cannot find in other religions. So this progressive worldview is operating on Christian ground and utilizing Christian terms to criticize Christianity. And that is probably as ironic as it gets. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like it and leave a comment and subscribe. I'm trying really hard to make as many videos as I can that are of quality. It's very difficult as I'm also a full-time student and full-time planning my wedding, etc. It's a lot of work. So I would greatly appreciate any support you could give me, and prayer. Obviously, that's the most important. But yeah, that's everything. I hope you have a wonderful day and stay blessed.